Showdown under the stars. Chapter 1. The hot midday sun beat down on the dusty main street of the small frontier town. Folks went about their business quietly and cautiously, wary of the ominous feeling that had settled over the place in recent days. Sheriff Johnson stood outside his office, squinting down the street as he chewed on a wad of tobacco. He spit into the dirt as he watched a group of riders approach in the distance. As the dozen or so men drew nearer, the sheriff's eyes narrowed. He recognized the cruel, bearded face of the man at the front of the pack. Knox Badman and his notorious gang of outlaws. The sheriff turned and hollered to his two deputies inside the office. "Get yourselves out here, boys. We got trouble brewing." The deputies, Joe and Timmy, hurried out onto the porch, pistols drawn as they eyed the approaching gang warily. The townsfolk who had been milling about on the streets scrambled indoors, peeking fearfully through windows and shutters. They had heard of the viciousness of the Badman gang, how they left death and destruction in their wake like a pack of rabid coyotes. Knox pulled back hard on the reins as they reached the center of town, the rest of his men following suit. He turned and spit a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt street before fixing the sheriff with a murderous glare. "Well, looky what we got here, boys. A bunch of law dogs think they stand a chance against the Badman gang." He and his men laughed viciously. "You best tell your piss-poor town to hand over anything of value, or we'll burn this dog hole to the ground. You hear me, law dog?" Sheriff Johnson stood firm, hand hovering over his holstered revolver. "I reckon you and your kind ain't welcome in this town, Badman. We're peaceful folk and don't want no trouble with your sort, so I suggest you ride on and trail someplace else." Knox grinned wickedly, giving a subtle nod to his men. "Is that so? Well, I ain't much for suggestions." He drew his pistol lightning quick and fired a single shot, piercing the sheriff's shoulder and sending him stumbling back. "Let's show this town what the Badman gang does to those who resist us, boys." Gunshots rang out as Knox and his men wheeled their horses around, firing relentlessly into the air and at anything in their path. They whooped and hollered like devils, drinking up the mayhem as windows shattered and townsfolk screamed in terror. Sheriff Johnson lay bleeding on the ground as his deputies futilely returned fire from the office porch. It was over as quickly as it started, the gang galloping, whooping down the street, leaving chaos and bodies in their wake. Dust hung thick in the air as cries of pain and alarm rose up all around. Knox Badman and his men were gone for now, but they had left their murderous mark on the little frontier town. Chapter 2. Sheriff Johnson gritted his teeth against the searing pain in his shoulder as he shoved open the saloon doors with his good arm. The raucous laughter inside died down as the injured sheriff staggered in, a blood-stained bandage wrapped around the bullet wound. The dozen or so gang members who had been drinking and carousing in the saloon eyed him with amused contempt. "Back for more already, law dog?" Knox grinned from his seat at the largest table in the place, feet up and whiskey in hand. "I'd thought my bullet would have taught you to stay clear of the Badman gang." The sheriff glared, refusing to be intimidated. "That bank money you stole don't belong to you, Knox. Now I aim to give you boys a chance to give it back and clear out before the US Marshals get here." The gang members stared at him incredulously before erupting in laughter. Knox slammed his fist down. "The US goddamn Marshals, you must be as crazy as you are stupid, lawmen," Knox sneered. "Ain't no lawman coming to help your pathetic little town. Not with me and my boys around to bury him." The sheriff stood resolute. "Your gang don't frighten me, Badman, and unless you clear out now, you'll have a war on your hands you can't win." Knox's eyes went cold and hard, his hand inching toward his holstered revolver. Last chance to walk away, law dog, 'fore I put you in the ground for good." Sheriff Johnson stepped forward and met Knox's glare with fire in his eyes. "I ain't going nowhere. That money ain't yours, and this is my town. I aim to take it back." In a blur of motion, Knox drew his Colt and fired, his men drawing their own weapons in sync. Hot lead slammed into the sheriff, pitching him backwards as the deafening fusillade thundered in the confined space. The lawman never stood a chance against the barrage, his body torn and shattered by the time Knox and his men finally eased their fingers off their triggers. The sheriff lay in a rapidly expanding pool of crimson on the saloon floor, eyes glassy and unseeing. Knox rose slowly and went to stand over the body, ejecting a smoking shell and sliding in a fresh round. "Guess this town's gonna need itself a new sheriff," he chuckled darkly. His men whooped and laughed as they holstered their recently fired guns. The matter was settled. Chapter 3. Dust swirled around the lone figure on horseback as he surveyed the small town from the ridge overlooking it. Sheriff Johnson's urgent telegram had found him, imploring him to come lend his skills before the Badman gang destroyed them. He had history with Knox Badman, and reckoned it was time to settle the score once and for all. Jackson Hawkins spit tobacco juice into the parched earth and flicked the reins, setting his horse down the slope toward the town. He had been hunting down Knox and his gang of killers for nigh on 3 years now, trailing them across 5 states and a dozen robbed banks. His reputation as a skilled bounty hunter preceded him, but Knox always managed to stay one step ahead somehow. This time, Jackson swore, would be different. As Jackson trotted through the outskirts of town, details of destruction became apparent. Bullet holes riddled the clapboard facades of buildings. Windows were shattered, doors smashed in. Several of the desperate townfolk eyed Jackson warily as they went about making repairs to their damaged town, sizing up the grim gunman. Jackson rode on until he reached the sheriff's office. The sight that greeted him made his blood boil. 2 deputies lay dead right there on the porch, buckets of dried blood staining the timbers around their fallen bodies. He dismounted and stepped inside the office, glancing around the room. More blood was spattered on the floor and walls from an obvious gunfight. The sheriff himself was nowhere to be seen. "Lost another one to that murderin' son of a bitch Knox," Jackson muttered under his breath. He had seen firsthand the aftermath of towns ravaged by the Badman gang before. Knox left few survivors when he came to call. Any lawmen foolish enough to stand up to him were slaughtered. It seemed Sheriff Johnson had met the same fate. Jackson's face was stone as he turned on his heel and marched back outside. He already had a sense of where Knox and his men would be holed up. His first stop was the saloon. Sure enough, raucous laughter and a honky-tonk piano could be heard from within. Jackson stepped up onto the porch and peered through the nearby window at the dozen or so gang members carousing inside. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Knox seated at a card game in the back, grinning wildly and slamming back shots of whiskey. "Soon as I round up a few more lawmen, you'll be at the business end of a rope, you son of a bitch," Jackson muttered under his breath before turning and walking back to where his horse was hitched. He had some quick recruitment to do. With a seasoned bounty hunter like him leading the charge, Knox Badman's days were numbered. Chapter 4. Knox Badman swayed tipsily in the saddle as he rode through the desert scrub outside of town with a handful of his gang members. They were headed for an old mining camp that they could use as a hideout for the time being after the ruckus they caused in town. Canteens sloshed as the outlaws rode leisurely beneath the baking midday sun. "Say, Knox, how long we gonna keep playing this cat-and-mouse game with the law?" asked Walt, Knox's second-in-command. We must have robbed near every bank for 100 miles hereabouts. Knox spat into the dusty trail. Your yellow wolf. A true outlaw don't never stop till he's either dead or too rich to run no more. He had lived his whole life on the wrong side of the law and intended to go out the same way. Just thinking our luck's gotta run out sooner or later, Walt muttered. Knox scoffed. Luck's got nothing to do with it. We make our own path, take what we want, and kill any fool who tries to stop us. That's the outlaw way. Ain't no sheriff or lawman tough enough to take me down. The rest of the men nodded and voiced agreement with Knox, their courage bolstered by whiskey and bravado. The desert hideout soon came into view, a ramshackle collection of old wooden structures with a working well. Knox directed 2 of his men to stand watch a ways out on the trail to give warning of any lawman approaching. The rest of the gang dismounted and made themselves at home in the abandoned mining buildings. They were well stocked with food and liquor for the time being. Should be easy pickings at that bank in the next town over, Knox declared as he bit the end off a cigar and spat it into the dirt. We'll give it a few days to let things settle, then ride in hard and fast. The men whooped excitedly, eager for more pillaging and plunder. Just then, shouts rang out from the lookouts down the trail. Knox and his men scrambled for their guns as a lone rider approached. Walt aimed his rifle warily at the approaching horseman. The rest fanned out, ready to light him up. As the rider drew closer, Knox relaxed slightly. It wasn't a lawman, just an old drunk miner by the looks of his ragged attire and near-empty bottle of rotgut whiskey. Probably just a local crazy coot. Knox whistled for the men to hold their fire as the miner's horse plodded up to the hideout. This here's a private spot, old-timer, Knox called out gruffly. Best keep ridden. The miner wavered in the saddle, raising his hands in submission. Can mean no harm, mister. Just looking for some fellas I used to work this here mine with long ago. Knox and his men exchanged looks. If this sot had worked the mine, he might know if there was anything of value still around to steal. Knox put on an amicable face and approached the miner. What say you come down and share some hooch with us? Maybe you can help recollect if there's any missed gold to be found hereabouts. The miner nodded drunkenly and dismounted, following Knox towards the largest shack. The gang gathered round, ready to grill him for anything of use. Chapter 5. Sheriff Johnson spat a wad of tobacco juice into the brass spittoon and leaned back in his creaky desk chair, pondering the telegram in his hands. He had sent word requesting urgent assistance from the US Marshals service in dealing with the menace of Knox Badman and his gang of ruthless outlaws. It appeared help was on the way. The telegram indicated a deputized group of marshals was being dispatched post-haste to the frontier town to aid local law enforcement against the threat. It was signed by the US Marshal for the territory himself, Jonas Mcall. At least a dozen hardened deputies were said to be accompanying the regional marshal. Sheriff Johnson breathed a little easier knowing justice was riding to town in force. He and his much smaller contingent of local deputies were simply outgunned and outmanned by Knox and his gang. The arrival of a force led by a legendary marshal like Jonas McCall seemed their best bet at finally corralling the murderous gang of bandits. Jonas McCall's reputation was well known, a tough, fearless lawman said to have tracked down some of the most dangerous outlaws in the territory. It was rumored he had Native American heritage that he used to his advantage in rugged pursuits of fugitives through backcountry only he could navigate. His scraggly features were said to give his feral stealth away, able to blend into the very wilderness he hunted in. Sheriff Johnson turned to his deputy Joe, who was attentively awaiting instruction. Go fetch Jackson Hawkins from the saloon. He'll want to meet with McCall when he arrives to help coordinate our efforts." The deputy nodded and exited swiftly. Jackson had proven to be their greatest asset, a seasoned bounty hunter with inside knowledge of Knox's criminal past and the cunning needed to match wits with him. Teamed up with a frontier legend like Jonas Mcall and his team of deputized marshals, Sheriff Johnson allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long while: hope. In a few days' time, the full force of lawful justice would arrive to help rid the town and territory of Knox Badman's scourge of violence. Until then, they had to keep their wits about them and avoid direct confrontation with the murderous gang. Help was on its way. Their long-wished-for reckoning was close at hand. With Jackson Hawkins and Jonas Mcall joining forces, Knox's days were surely numbered. Chapter 6. The thundering of hooves announced the arrival of the marshals long before they crested the hill overlooking the town. Sheriff Johnson and Jackson stood outside the sheriff's office, waiting expectantly as the large posse of armed lawmen rode into town in a cloud of dust. The marshals sat tall in their saddles, grim-faced beneath their Stetson hats, as they surveyed the bullet-riddled buildings. Their dusters trailed behind them dramatically as they rode 2 by 2 down the main street, finally coming to a stop before the sheriff's office. The townsfolk peered curiously through shutters at the legion of tough, as leather lawmen who had arrived to restore order. One marshal separated himself from the pack, guiding his horse forward until he was directly in front of the sheriff and Jackson. He had pronounced Native American features beneath his hat, long raven hair tied back behind his head. His leathered face was creased with fragments of old scars. This had to be the legendary Jonas Mcall. "Sheriff Johnson," McCall said in a gritty voice. "US Marshal Jonas Mcall, my deputies and I are here to help clean up this town." He gestured to the 15 stone-faced marshals on horseback behind him. Sheriff Johnson nodded gratefully. "Appreciate you fellas lending a hand. These are dangerous men we're up against, crafty too." McCall's eyes narrowed coldly. "We'll see about that." He turned his eyes to Jackson then. "Name's Hawkins, ain't it? I've heard of your bounty hunting. Reckon we'll make use of your familiarity with this Badman fella." Jackson dipped his head respectfully, sizing up McCall and his team. Having seen the aftermath of Knox's chaos himself, these men seemed hardened and capable enough to potentially match the gang's ruthlessness. Only time would tell. McCall directed his marshals to stable their horses as he followed the sheriff and Jackson into the office to strategize. They gathered around a rough-hewn table on which a crude map of the surrounding area was spread out. McCall studied it closely, plotting points Knox had been spotted and likely hideouts. "Best we can tell, the gangs hold up here," the sheriff said, tapping a circled spot on the map. "Abandoned mining camp, reason to think there may still be undiscovered gold deposits there attracting them." McCall nodded, looking to Jackson. "You know Badman's mind. What's our best move?" Jackson scratched his unshaven jaw. "Knox won't be expecting a posse this big gunning for him. If we ride undercover at night, could take him by surprise before sunup." McCall considered this, eyes still fixed on the map. "Risk is they flee into the wilderness where we lose their trail. I say we scout first, get the lay of things, then make our move when the time is right." Chapter 7. Jonas Mcall stood bristling as Black Wolf. The formidable Native American marshal he had brought along loudly voiced his dissent. "You cannot simply rush in guns blazing, hoping to overwhelm them with numbers and surprise," Black Wolf insisted. "We must exercise caution and strategy." Sheriff Johnson shook his head. "Every minute we delay gives them more time to escape or kill again. We need to strike swift and hard. That's our best bet. The Marshals were split between McCall's stealth approach and Black Wolf's calls for patience and care. Jackson watched the rising tensions closely, sensing the need to unify them. "Hold up now," Jackson said, stepping forward. "I understand both your points here, but we gotta work together if we aim to take these boys down." Black Wolf and McCall fell silent, looking to Jackson along with the rest. The bounty hunter cleared his throat and continued. "Now, Knox and his men are as cunning as they are deadly. A full frontal assault is risky, but so is waiting too long. I say we send out a scouting party first to get the lay of the hideout and report back. Get eyes on them. Once we know what we're up against, we decide whether to attack direct or draw, mount subtle like into a trap." The lawmen exchanged thoughtful glances as they considered Jackson's compromise idea. Finally, Black Wolf gave a nod of agreement. "You talk sense, bounty hunter. We will send scouts to assess the situation first before developing our plan of attack." He looked to McCall and Sheriff Johnson. "Can we agree on this prudent course?" McCall scratched his grizzled jaw as he pondered a moment. Finally, he nodded as well. "Reckon that's wise. No sense blindly kicking a hornet's nest, for we know how big it is." Sheriff Johnson also gave his assent, realizing Jackson's balanced approach made good sense. "All right then, let's get a couple volunteers to scout ahead by cover of darkness tonight. We'll reconvene here at first light to review what they found and decide our next move." Having unified the dissenting lawmen around a tactical plan, Jackson allowed himself a flicker of optimism. With McCall's dutiful marshals, Black Wolf's frontier skills, and his own intimate knowledge of Knox's criminal mind, perhaps they stood a chance after all. There would be bloodshed yet, but hitting smart was key. Over a meal of grub, coffee, and tobacco, they worked out the particulars of who would scout and how to remain undetected. Two of Black Wolf's native marshals had stealth skills suited for the task. They would leave when the moon rose, trace Knox's gang under its pale light, and report back before dawn broke over the dusty little town again. Night fell, and the native scouts slipped off silently into darkness. The rest tried to grab some shut-eye, knowing that this could be the calm before the storm of a vicious gun battle with Knox's men. When day broke, they would know if the violent confrontation was imminent or not. Either way, they had to be ready. Chapter 8. Knox Badman crept through the moon-washed night, pistol gripped tightly in hand. Ever since the miner had revealed tales of a hidden gold vein deep inside the mining tunnels, he hadn't been able to resist coming back to comb them alone under cover of darkness. All his men were asleep back at the hideout, as he'd snuck out to search the abandoned shafts. The cool night air raised goosebumps on Knox's neck as he glanced around warily, sensing he wasn't alone out here. Could just be critters or coyotes, but his gut said different. He spun, gun raised instinctively, as a few pebbles skittered down the rocky slope behind him. Knox backed up into the mine entrance, peering out into the dim night. "Show yourself," he growled. "I'll shoot first and ask questions after." His voice echoed slightly against the rock walls. Only silence greeted him. Knox lingered there for several long minutes, watching, listening. Finally convincing himself it must have been an animal after all, Knox turned and headed back into the mine. Far above on the rocky ridge, one of the native scouts let out a slow breath as the gang leader disappeared into the darkness of the tunnels. It had been close, any closer, and Knox surely would have spotted him. But from his vantage point, the scout had been able to track Badman's movements, verifying he and his men were holed up here. With stealth that would make a coyote envious, the scout faded back into the night. Come sunrise, the lawmen would know exactly where to find their quarry. All that remained now was to determine the best method of attack, an all-out assault to overwhelm them, or a subtle snare to draw the cunning gang into the open. Either way, the marshals knew the hideout location. Justice was soon to be served. As dawn's first light peeked over the distant mountains, the two native scouts noiselessly made their way back to town. The rest of the posse was gathered outside the sheriff's office, awaiting the scouts' report. Spotting them approach, McCall stepped forward expectantly. "What'd you find? Are they at the mine?" One scout nodded. "All present and accounted for, we know right where they lay." McCall turned to Jackson and the sheriff with a fierce glint in his eye. "Time we finish this, gather the men." The day of reckoning had arrived. One way or another, the reign of Knox Badman would end today. Chapter 9. Knox Badman, cursed as yet another shot from the marshals fizzed past his head, kicking up dirt from the abandoned mine's outer wall he was using for cover. It seemed wherever he and his gang fled on horseback, more lawmen appeared, as if rising up out of the very earth. It was soon clear they were being expertly herded into an ambush. "We're surrounded, Knox," Walt yelled over the cacophony of gunfire. "We gotta make a run for open country if we're gonna get out of this." Knox fired off a few fruitless shots from where he was pinned down. The bastards had the abandoned mining camp surrounded on all sides. "Damn it," Knox snarled. "Make for that ravine. It's our only chance. Draw their fire on the way. I'll hold 'em here best I can." Walt hesitated briefly, but knew better than to argue with the murderous glint in the gang leader's eyes. He whistled sharply to signal the retreat as Knox lay down cover fire. The gang members came barreling out, guns blazing from all around the dilapidated mining camp. Dust and gun smoke filled the air as the marshals returned fire fiercely. One by one, the outlaws made it to their horses and took off for the ravine Knox had pointed out, a natural trench that could shield them somewhat from the lawmen's bullets. From his pinned position, Knox picked off one marshal trying to block their escape route, then another who attempted to follow them to the ravine on horseback. As the rest of the gang made their escape, Knox scrambled atop his own steed and pelted after them, weaving drunkenly as bullets whizzed past. The lawmen poured lead after the fleeing men, managing to hit a couple gang members who tumbled to the dusty earth before making the ravine. But most of the gang managed to follow Walt's mad dash along the gulch to safety, Knox firing back wildly as he brought up the rear. Finally, the marshal's guns fell silent as the last of the outlaws slipped out of range. Knox spit angrily into the dirt as he and his gang regrouped. The law may have won this skirmish, but they had yet to put a scratch on Knox Badman. As long as he drew breath, they hadn't seen the last of him. He would make damn sure of that. Chapter 10. The tension around the battered old mine was palpable as the marshals swiftly secured the area. Nearly a dozen bodies of Knox's gang were strewn about the bullet pock camp, but there was no sign of the man himself among the dead. Jonas McCall's face was stone as he surveyed the scene. Badman had managed to slip the noose again. Sheriff Johnson looked uneasy as well. "Reckon Knox is out there plotting his next move as we speak. We gotta get after him while the trail's still hot." Black Wolf held up a hand. "The day grows long and our horses are spent. It would be foolish to stumble after them blindly into the dark." He could read the frustration on the faces of the other lawmen, but it was the wise path. As much as he too yearned to pursue Knox without delay, attempting to track him through the wilderness at night would almost certainly fail. They needed to regroup and reconsider their approach. Suddenly, a shout went up from one of McCall's deputies who had been searching the outlaws' dwellings. He emerged dragging a bloodied and bound man, one of Knox's surviving gang members who had been unable to flee. The marshals quickly gathered round, an almost feral hunger in their eyes at the prospect of squeezing intel out of this prisoner that could point them to Knox. The outlaw was deposited in the dirt before the assembled lawmen. Black Wolf drew a wickedly curved blade from his belt and knelt beside the wide-eyed man. "You know much about the hunting practices of wolves?" Black Wolf asked in an icy calm tone. "How the pack singles out the weakest, wears it down slowly with bites and scrapes, until the blood loss weakens it beyond resistance or escape." He traced the tip of the blade down the man's cheek, drawing a thin crimson line. "Tell us what we want to know, and your end will be quick." The terrified gang member needed little convincing, spilling everything he knew of Knox's plans and possible whereabouts. Black Wolf cleaned his blade, sharing a look with McCall. Come sunrise, the real hunt would begin. Chapter 11. Knox Badman warily eyed the furtive figure who had come seeking him out where the remnants of the gang were holed up in the Badlands. Though dressed like them in worn duster and beat-up cowboy hat, something about the man's manner didn't sit right with Knox. Still, they needed all the guns they could get. "Says you want to ride with us," Knox rasped. Sizing the man up, Knox scrutinized him closely, searching for any sign of deception. "And just why is a fellow like you want to throw your lot in with the Badman gang anyways?" The man met his gaze levelly. "Ain't got no love for lawmen or marshals. Heard you boys been giving them hell. Figured you could use another gun hand against them." Knox slowly nodded, considering it. The gang was weakened and on the run. Another skilled gun on their side could prove useful. "All right, you're in, but cross me even once, and you'll have a belly full of lead, understand?" "Loud and clear," the man replied. Knox gestured for Walt to fetch this newcomer some food and ammo. He introduced himself simply as Jackson, no surname given. Something about the steely look in his eyes seemed eerily familiar to Knox. Still, they desperately needed more firepower if they were to have any chance against McCall's marshals. Knox would make use of Jackson for now. Over the next few days, Jackson integrated himself seamlessly into the gang's ranks, never once arousing suspicion as they made their way deeper into the twisting canyons. He was taciturn but capable with a gun, helping defend the group when a scouting party of marshals engaged them in a brief firefight. Knox was beginning to think bringing Jackson into the fold had been a wise move. When a meeting was called to discuss their next move, Knox looked to Jackson expectantly along with the other men. "McCall will keep coming after us with everything he's got. We need to hit him where it hurts if we aim to come out of this alive. Any ideas?" Jackson removed his hat and scratched his head as if deep in thought. "Word is there's a big payroll shipment coming in by train to Fort Mercer. Could solve our money problems and deal McCall a heavy blow if we hit it." Knox's eyes lit up greedily at the prospect. It was risky, but potentially worth it. "All right, let's start planning this train job." Chapter 12. The roar of gunfire filled the canyon pass as Jackson dove for cover, bullets whizzing overhead from the gang members who had discovered his deception. He should have known Knox would sniff him out sooner or later. Now, every damned one of the outlaws had their sights trained on him. Jackson scrambled over rocks and scrub brush as lead rained down around him, making for a crevice in the canyon wall that could shield him long enough to return fire. But just as he reached it, a slug tore through his shoulder in a burst of searing pain, pitching him to the ground. Jackson grimaced, trying to steady his gun hand as Knox and his men closed in for the kill. Shoulda known you were a no-good lying yellow-belly bounty hunter, Knox snarled, his pistol aimed squarely at Jackson's chest. I'll make sure to give your corpse to the buzzards when I'm done with you. Jackson met Knox's crazed eyes unflinchingly. Go to hell, Badman. His gun flashed as he emptied every round he had left towards Knox and the gang, not even aiming, just hoping to hit flesh and buy himself time. Howls of pain told him some shots found their mark. As the gang scrambled for cover from Jackson's deadly barrage, he seized the window to bolt for where he'd left his horse tethered. Jackson knew he'd be dead for sure if he didn't get some distance. Spurs raking bloody furrows in his mount's flank, Jackson galloped away from the enraged shouts of Knox Badman's gang. Bullets whizzed past him as they fired unsuccessfully at his rapidly retreating form. He needed to find the lawmen, and fast. The train heist was coming. By the time Jackson reconnected with McCall and the posse some miles away, he was pale and swaying in the saddle from blood loss. As the marshals tended to his wounds, he urgently related the new information about the train job, judging by the position of the sun that it could take place in less than 2 days' time. McCall's expression was grave as he digested this. If Badman and his men get their hands on that payroll money, they'll be able to sustain their outlaw ways for months to come. We'll need to stop them dead in their tracks. He turned to instruct his deputies to scout the rail line and prepare ambush points. Jackson nodded weakly. He only hoped he'd make it in time to finally witness Knox get what was coming to him. Chapter 13. The thunder of hooves split the silence of the moonlit desert as Jackson Hawkins raced along the old Spanish trail, a plume of dust rising behind him. His wounded shoulder burned fiercely, but it barely registered through the adrenaline and urgency pulsing through his veins. He had to beat Knox and the gang to the train. The Robb Canyon Pass was just ahead, the spot the sheriff had said was closest along the rail line for an ambush. As Jackson approached, he could just make out shadowy forms of men and horses gathered near the mouth of the canyon. The lawmen were lying in wait, prepared to spring their trap on Knox and his boys when they attempted to rob the train. As Jackson rode up fast, Jonas Mcall withdrew from the darkness by the canyon mouth to intercept him. Take it you got away from Badman. Wanted the train robbery? Jackson quickly dismounted. Knox aims to hit that payroll shipment tomorrow morning. As it comes through Flat Top Tunnel a few miles east of here, I rode through hell to get here in time to warn you so we can set the ambush. McCall nodded, a glint in his eye. Good work, son. You best get those wounds tended to now. When the time comes, we'll be ready and waiting for Badman. He clasped Jackson's good shoulder and turned to relay the critical new intelligence to his marshals. They mobilized swiftly, the lawmen melting into the landscape to set up positions around the eastern tunnel along the rail line in anticipation of tomorrow's heist attempt. As Jackson helped prepare through the night, a sense of promise permeated the desert air. Through wits and grit, they had overcome turncoat gang members and traitors in their own ranks to arrive at this moment. Come sunrise, it would be justice or death. Either Knox would escape yet again, or the long arm of the law would finally close around his throat once and for all. For better or worse, the matter would be decided tomorrow. Jackson refused to let his hopes get too high. He knew better than any how cunning Knox could be, but something told him this time would be different. The marshals were prepared, armed with the element of surprise. All that remained was to lie in wait as the prime opportunity to ensnare Knox drew inexorably closer with each turn of the stars overhead. The shroud of night still clung to the desert landscape as Jackson and the Marshals maintained their stealthy positions surrounding flat-top tunnel. Dawn was not far off now. Before long, the freight train Knox planned to rob would come steaming through, packed with its valuable government payroll shipment. Time ticked by at an agonizing crawl. Jackson chewed on some beef jerky to pass the time and take the edge off his gnawing hunger. His wounded shoulder throbbed something fierce, but he hardly noticed, focused intently on watching for any signs of Knox's approach. Just when it seemed the anticipation might drive them all mad, a train whistle sounded in the distance, followed by the first faint chugging of the engine. It was time. McCall hand signaled the lawmen to readiness as the train's sounds grew louder, billowing steam becoming visible down the tracks. Rifles were steadied, pistols loosened in their holsters in preparation. As Jackson crouched behind cover beside the marshal, his heart thundering, a shouted voice suddenly rang out. It was the unmistakable furious yell of Knox Badman. Shots rang through the chilly dawn air as the gang swarmed the halted train. The ambush was sprung. Chapter 14. Knox Badman let loose a rebel yell as he charged with guns blazing towards the stalled train. Caught completely off guard, the armed guards escorting the payroll shipment scrambled for cover, unable to mount any defense as a storm of hot lead bore down on them. From all sides, Knox's men swarmed the stopped locomotive, bullets shattering windows and ripping into steel sides. "Grab the money car and let's get the hell out of here," Knox bellowed over the cacophony of gunfire. This job was already going smoother than he could have hoped. He'd been cautious on approach, suspecting a posse ambush after the trouble with that bounty hunter Jackson. But so far the law was nowhere to be seen. Walt and two others fought their way toward the payroll car, dropping the armed guards in their path with ruthless efficiency. The take from this job would set the surviving members of the gang for life if they could just get away clean. Knox provided cover fire as Walt slid open the car's door to start unloading the sacks of cash. Suddenly, a whistling volley of bullets pelted the dirt around the stopped train from unseen assailants. "Take cover, boys, it's a setup," Knox yelled furiously, ducking behind the locomotive. Damn it, his instincts had been right. The lawmen had laid a trap after all. Bullets peppered the cars and earth from both sides as McCall's marshals swarmed the scene, unleashing orchestrated hell. Outgunned, Knox ordered two men to cover the retreat as the rest scrambled to mount up and flee with what little loot they'd managed to grab. He spurred his steed viciously toward the canyon pass they had scouted as an exit point before the ambush closed off. His heart froze as riflemen rose from hiding places among the rocks, rifles trained on him. There would be no escape that way. "Ride for the gorge, it's our only chance," Knox bellowed in desperation, seeing the net tightening around them. As bullets buzzed murderously past their heads, the outlaws fled for the deep canyon gorge that sliced through the landscape to the north. Their only hope was its sheer walls would shield them from the Marshals' deadly fusillade. Fleeing into its precipitous depths, torn up by bullets but alive, Knox cursed himself for underestimating his enemies. If they survived this debacle, he vowed revenge. Chapter 15. Muzzle flashes lit up the moonlit canyon floor as chaos erupted all around. The trap had been sprung, and now it was pure pandemonium. Marshals' horses reared in terror as bullets flew in all directions, the shouts of men and noise of pistols discharging creating a deafening din. Bodies began falling on both sides in the calamitous shootout. From behind cover, Jackson searched desperately for Batman in the blinding gunsmoke, hoping to draw a bead on the murderous outlaw leader. There Knox's unmistakable visage appeared through the haze, firing his pistols wildly as he charged towards the payroll car. Jackson levered his rifle and fired, the round splintering wood inches from Knox's head. Cursing, Knox dodged Jackson's follow-up shots and scrambled for better cover. The bounty hunter scanned for his target again as tangled horsemen and gunfire raged around him. There was Wall and two others attempting to fight through to the valuables car. Jackson drew his second pistol and dropped one gang member with a neck shot before having to duck to avoid return fire. When he popped up again, the payroll car was unguarded. Some lawmen had fallen, but McCall was smoothly directing the others to flank Knox's men in a pincer movement. Black Wolf had gathered a group atop the canyon rim, raining deadly fire on gang members trying to flee or outflank the marshals below. They had Badman's boys surrounded. Now they just needed to tighten the noose. Suddenly, a cry rang out as an outlaw was winged, trying to escape on horseback. His pistol slipped from his hand and discharged as he fell, the stray round striking Marshal McCall in the thigh. He crumpled with a grunt of pain, blood spreading fast from the grievous leg wound. Seeing their leader stricken, the marshals wavered briefly, at risk of losing control of the skirmish. This window of distraction was all Wall, and Knox needed to gather the remaining men for a desperate push towards escape. With McCall down and the lawmen's assault faltering, Knox seized the opportunity to go on the offensive. He rallied his remaining gang members with a fearsome war cry. "Hit 'em with everything you got, boys!" Knox roared, charging from cover with both guns erupting flames. Caught off guard, a few marshals were cut down in the initial deadly barrage. Emboldened, the rest of Knox's men added their firepower to his headlong assault. Being driven further back towards the canyon walls, the marshals were at risk of wholesale slaughter. Black Wolf, attempting to lead reinforcements down into the canyon, was the only thing stemming complete disaster. Seeing this, Jackson knew it was now or never if he was to stop Knox. With a primal scream, Jackson lunged from behind his rocky barricade straight for the blinded by bloodlust outlaw leader. Before Knox even realized his peril, Jackson tackled him with explosive force, sending them both crashing to the ground. Knox's pistols were knocked loose as they grappled fiercely in the dirt. "I've got you now, you bastard," Jackson shouted hoarsely. But Knox managed to slip a hidden blade from his boot and rake it viciously across Jackson's temple, stunning him. As Jackson reeled, Knox scrambled for one of his dropped revolvers. "You're a dead man," Knox snarled, drawing down on the dazed bounty hunter with murder in his eyes. Jackson looked up blearily to see death looming. But a single rifle crack split the night, and Knox was knocked backward by the kill shot before he could fire. A perfect hole punched through his forehead. Jackson gazed up in disbelief to see Black Wolf tracking Knox's lifeless body, tumbling to the ground with his smoking rifle barrel. They had done it, and Knox Badman was no more. Chapter 16. Chaos still reigned in the moonlit canyon as the remaining gang members realized Knox was dead. Some immediately threw down their weapons and surrendered, while a few diehards refused to give up the fight just yet. Black Wolf calmly picked off two outlaws attempting to flee before they made it 20 yards. The writing was on the wall. The posse had won. As Jackson struggled to rise, his head still swimming from Knox's blade, he witnessed the last of the resistance drain from Badman's now leaderless gang. Those left standing had seen enough bloodshed and wanted no more leads slung their way. One by one, they discarded their firearms, and submitted to being shackled by stone-faced marshals. It was over at last. With the gang members secured, Jackson scrambled over to where McCall still lay grimacing, a tourniquet now tight above his bullet-shattered knee. The leg didn't look good. McCall met Jackson's concerned eyes with a brave grimace. "Reckon my marshalling days are done," McCall rasped through the pain, "but we got the job done, thanks to you." He clasped Jackson's shoulder with blood-smeared hand. "Couldn't have ended this nightmare without you, son." Jackson, overcome with emotion, could only nod. He hoped the stoic lawman's leg would heal in time, though it seemed unlikely. Their victory had come with a cost. Not just McCall's leg, at least a half-dozen marshals had paid with their lives tonight. But Knox and his vicious crew would never rob or terrorize again. It was finally over. As dawn's first light seeped into the canyon, the marshals wasted no time loading the shackled prisoners onto the train for transport to stand trial. The outlaw leader's corpse was unceremoniously heaved aboard as well to be turned over to the proper authorities. Jackson looked on grimly as the locomotive chugged off with its cargo, some bound for the noose, other for ruins and redemption. Turning his horse about, Jackson let the marshal service handle the rest. His role here was done. Justice had prevailed. He just prayed this was one ghost that would not come back to haunt him. Chapter 17. Jonas Mcall winced as his leg was jostled while being carried aboard the train to receive proper medical care. Even through the haze of pain, he forced himself to remain stoic. The bullet had done severe damage, but it mattered not. The sacrifice had been worth it to see Knox Badman's reign of terror ended for good. As Jackson helped get the wounded lawmen settled into the compartment serving as an infirmary car, Mcall gripped the bounty hunter's forearm firmly. "What you did took real grit," he said in a pained but sincere tone. "Ain't many with the courage to infiltrate a pack of murderers as you did to bring them to justice." Jackson shifted uncomfortably at the marshal's praise. He had only done what was necessary to take down a dangerous man. But McCall's words kindled a sense of hard-won satisfaction within him nonetheless. The frontier was a little safer tonight thanks to their shared efforts. With McCall's legs seen to, Jackson departed the train to go help the remaining marshals prepare the outlaw prisoners for transport to stand trial. Most had surrendered freely, weary of bloodshed. But a few die-hards had needed some extra convincing. Jackson eyed the line of chained men being led to the stock cars, satisfied to see them brought low. One marshal was having particular trouble with a large, bald outlaw named Bull, who was putting up fierce resistance. As Bull violently thrashed against his restraints, Black Wolf calmly approached from behind and delivered a swift blow with the handle of his tomahawk to the base of the big man's skull, instantly dropping him cold. Jackson suppressed a grin. Efficient lawman, that one. The train lurched as the last prisoner was loaded, steam hissing from the engine. It was time. Jackson turned to Black Wolf and they exchanged a meaningful handshake. The stoic Indian had been invaluable in ending the threat of Knox for good. His tribes would remain safer thanks to their combined efforts. With the prisoners secured and lawmen tended to, the train slowly rumbled off into the dawning Arizona desert. Jackson stood watching it recede into the distance, at long last feeling a sense of hard-earned peace. It was finally finished. Knox Badman would terrorize the frontier no more. Chapter 18. Dust swirled down the deserted main street of the frontier town as a lone figure walked slowly through the fading light. Jackson Hawkins' spurs jangled softly with each step as he made his way towards the saloon at the end of the row of buildings. Tonight, he aimed to get a stiff drink. Pushing through the creaky wooden doors, Jackson found the saloon empty save for the barkeep wiping down glasses. He sank down heavily onto a stool at the bar and tossed some coins on the aged wood. "Whiskey, leave the bottle," Jackson rasped wearily. The barkeep silently obliged, sensing his patron wasn't aiming for conversation. As the first fiery gulps burned down Jackson's throat, his thoughts drifted back to that fateful night in the moonlit canyon. He saw again a muzzle flash that sent the killer of his past finally tumbling into the dirt, dead by Black Wolf's aim, but through Jackson's efforts. After a lifetime of chasing Knox Badman, of having his life poisoned by fear and hatred of the man, it was still hard to believe the demon had been vanquished for good. But vanquished he was. Jackson had witnessed the light leave the bastard's eyes himself. Pouring another shot with a shake of the bottle, Jackson knew he'd replay that electrifying moment over and over in his restless dreams. He had longed for that reckoning what felt like a lifetime. Now that it had come and gone, relief mingled with the fulfillment of seeing justice served. Perhaps now, having seen this through to the bitter end, he could begin to find some sense of peace. Jackson had heard Marshal Jonas McCall ended up losing his leg from that bullet at the canyon shootout. A damn shame, but the stoic lawman had taken it in stride, just grateful Knox was finished. Honorably discharged from service, last Jackson heard McCall had returned home to wife and kin to enjoy a well-earned retirement. Jackson envied the man's clear conscience. His own path remained less defined now that his driving purpose had been fulfilled. For tonight, the whiskey would provide escape and numbness. Tomorrow would take care of itself. But one thing Jackson knew, whenever he thought of Knox Badman from this day forth, it would be with the contentment of a man finally liberated from his demons. Chapter 19. Raucous piano music filled the crowded saloon as the townspeople drank and danced deep into the night. With the death of Knox Badman, it was like a dark cloud had lifted from the place. Now folk could laugh and carouse without having to worry if they'd get caught in the crossfire of a deadly gang shootout. At long last, the town felt alive again. Jackson stood off to the side, observing the revelry with a flicker of a smile touching his weathered face. After spending so long immersed in darkness chasing Badman, seeing decent ordinary folks able to enjoy life's simple pleasures unmolested filled his heart near to bursting. This was why he had sacrificed so much. Jackson leaned back against the bar, content to watch the celebration unfold. The threat that had hung so heavy over this place was gone, thanks in large part to his efforts. It felt good to see people experiencing joy and levity again, able to walk the streets without fear of the Badman gang descending upon them. The sheriff caught Jackson's eye from across the crowded saloon and nodded gratefully. He began to weave through the throng of dancing townspeople toward the bounty hunter. Jackson straightened as the sheriff approached. "None of this would be possible without you, son," the sheriff said, gesturing around the room. "We're forever in your debt. If there's ever anything you need, anything at all, you just say the word." Jackson dipped his head. "Just did what needed doing. All I want now is to see this town and its people prosper." The sheriff smiled and firmly shook Jackson's hand. "That's thanks to you. This town will never forget what you sacrificed." Jackson watched as the sheriff made his way back through the sea of smiling faces laughing and drinking without fear. A weight seemed to have lifted from the people. The shadow departed. His work here was done. With a bittersweet sense of finality, Jackson drained his whiskey and slipped quietly out the saloon's rear exit. This was their celebration now. He wished the folks well. Stepping into the night, Jackson glanced up at the blanket of stars above. For the first time in a long while, the future felt full of possibility again. Badman was gone for good, and he could finally seek the peaceful life that had eluded him. As he made his way to the stables to gather his horse, Jackson felt the satisfaction of knowing things were as right as they could be. It was time to ride on to new horizons. Chapter 20. Jackson Hawkins stood on the train platform, squinting against the billowing smoke pouring from the locomotive stack. He hefted his saddlebags over his shoulder as the train squealed to a stop before him. It was time to move on from this place, his work here completed. The passengers stared curiously at Jackson through the grimy windows as he boarded, some recognizing him as the man who had helped rid the town of the vicious Batman gang. Quiet murmurs trailed him as he made his way down the crowded aisle before finding an empty seat. Setting his gear on the floor by his feet, Jackson removed his hat and made himself comfortable. With a jolt and the shrill blast of its whistle, the train lurched into motion, slowly picking up speed as it left the tiny frontier town behind. Jackson watched through the window as it shrank into the distance, becoming little more than a speck. He felt no sadness in leaving it behind. It had only ever been a waypoint on his long journey, never a destination. Now it too was part of his past. The clacking rhythm of the tracks soon lulled Jackson into a doze. In his dreams, he was back in that moonlit canyon the night they brought down Batman for good. He could see the muzzle flash lighting up Knox's crazed, sadistic face in that electrifying instant before oblivion claimed him. Even now, Jackson marveled that the specter that had haunted him for so long was finally exorcised. A bump jostled Jackson from his slumber. Glancing out the window, he saw the train was passing Fort Mercer, the cavalry outpost where the captured members of Knox's gang had been transferred to await trial after the failed payroll heist. Jackson wondered how many would swing from the gallows and how many would rot away in a prison cell instead. It mattered little, they were ruined men now. The law had prevailed. Settling back in his seat, Jackson let out a tired sigh. He didn't rightly know where he was headed next. For now, putting more miles between him and his past seemed like as good an aim as any. The cool desert wind on his face as this train carried him onward felt like a breath of new life. For the first time in forever, the possibilities seemed endless. Chapter 21. Motes of dust danced in the fading daylight streaming through the windows of McAllister's hotel as Jackson shoved through the creaky front door. He had finally returned to this town after many months away following the death of Knox Badman. It was here that his long journey had begun, when he had first dedicated himself to taking down the outlaw. Now he was back to close that chapter for good. The desk clerk glanced up with vague recognition as Jackson approached across the worn lobby floorboards. Taking a small iron key from the wall, the clerk nodded to Jackson. "Good to see you again, number 4, end of the hall." Jackson dipped his head in thanks and made his way down the narrow corridor bathed in afternoon light. The last door on the left bore the chipped number 4. Unlocking it, Jackson stepped inside the modest room that he recalled all too well. Faded wallpaper, threadbare quilt, and musty smell that never seemed to go away. Almost like stepping back in time. Tossing his saddlebags on the lumpy mattress, Jackson crossed over to the small window overlooking Main Street. The bank Knox had robbed all those years ago stood across the way. It almost seemed impossible now that the notorious outlaw was gone for good, after leaving such deep scars on this place and its people. The specter that had haunted Jackson for so long vanquished. Turning from the window with a heavy sigh, Jackson knew why he had come. Opening his saddlebags, he reverently withdrew the bundle of letters he had been keeping all this time. Letters from his wife Amelia back home, imploring him to give up the chase after Knox and return to her and their newborn son. Letters that guilt had forced Jackson to ignore. Kneeling solemnly, Jackson removed a tin of matches from his pocket. Striking one, he set the corner of the bundle aflame and watched as his past burned away. He had chosen his path then, but now it was time for healing. Time to finally go home and start making amends. Tomorrow, he would ride for Texas. But tonight, he would make peace with the ghosts of his past. Chapter 22. The hot midday sun beat down on Jackson Hawkins as he rode solemnly through the scrub-dotted prairie. Ahead in the shimmering distance, the outskirts of his hometown were coming into view. After near 10 years chasing Knox Badman, the time had come for Jackson to return home. Apprehension and hope dueled within him. As the dusty buildings came into clearer view, memories flooded Jackson's mind. He had been little more than a boy when he departed this place, setting forth with fire in his eyes to hunt down the outlaw Knox after reading of his latest horrific crime. That singular hatred had consumed Jackson, driving him onward during the long years of fruitless pursuit, always one step behind Knox and his gang. Reaching the edge of town, Jackson slowed his steed to an amble. Folk eyed him curiously from porches and storefronts as he rode by. Did anyone recognize the hardened man he had become after so long away? The Jackson these people remembered had died a long time ago. He wondered if there was enough left of that optimistic young man to salvage. Turning down a side street, Jackson felt his breath catch. The neat little cottage was still there after all this time. He had dreamed of returning here once Badman was dead and gone. That day had finally arrived, but now doubt crept in. Could he pick up the pieces of the life his quest for vengeance had destroyed? Did he even have the right? Dismounting slowly, Jackson approached the gate. The paint was faded and weathered, but otherwise the place looked unchanged. He pictured Amelia on the porch reading, waiting for his return. Joyful cries of his son, Thomas, playing in the yard rang in his memory, echoes of a lost past. Taking a deep breath, Jackson opened the gate and hesitantly stepped through. He did not know if this could ever truly be home again after so long chasing ghosts. But for those he loved, he had to try. The door had opened, and through eyes clouded with emotion, Jackson saw the one person he had never forgotten. His heart overflowed. He was finally home. The end.